Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling, right?
Sure.
You've got a stack of articles, some research papers, maybe parts of a book, all on a complex topic you really want to understand. But there's just so much information.
It's overwhelming.
Totally. You need a shortcut, a way to cut through the noise and get straight to the essential insights, the surprising facts, the stuff that genuinely changes how you see things.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we do here on the Deep Dive. We take your sources, the material you bring, and we extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, tailored just for you.
Exactly.
And for this deep dive, we're tackling a huge topic: understanding the lives and economic decisions of the poor. Our source material today is drawn specifically from excerpts of the brilliant book, Poor Economics.
Fantastic book.
It really is. It dives deep into the realities on the ground.
That's right. And our mission in this deep dive is to go beyond the often heard, sometimes simplistic explanations about poverty. We want to uncover, surprising findings about how poverty actually works in practice. What the real constraints are for people living on very little, and what kinds of interventions the sources suggest might actually make a difference.
Right.
We'll look at everything from deeply personal decisions about what to eat or how much to save, all the way up to big picture debates about global aid, government policy, and even politics based on the material you've shared.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Something that really struck me from the sources is the powerful experiment. It shows something fundamental about how we kind of think about poverty and suffering. And remember that study with the flyers?
Yeah.
One talked about the millions suffering in Africa, this huge, abstract, almost unimaginable number. The other focused on one single identifiable girl named Rokia.
Yes, that study is absolutely fascinating, and it tells us so much about human psychology, doesn't it?
It really does.
The flyer featuring Rokia, that one identifiable victim, raised significantly more money per student in the experiment, $2.83 compared to just $1.16 for the flyer about the millions suffering.
Wow, more than double.
Exactly. What's striking here is how highlighting an individual face resonated so much more powerfully than presenting the vast, overwhelming scale of the problem.
It seems numbers, especially huge ones, can sometimes, well, numb us.
Yeah, they can. And what's even more interesting, connecting this to the bigger picture, they found that telling students why this happens, explaining the identifiable victim effect, actually made them less generous to Rokia.
Really?
But it didn't make them more generous to the millions. It sort of leveled generosity downwards.
Huh. That raises some big questions about how we react to information and scale, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the sources draw that connection. That difficulty in connecting with abstract large numbers maps directly onto the big debates you see playing out, for instance, around foreign aid.
Okay, like the Sachs versus Easterly debate.
Precisely. On one side, you have figures like Jeffrey Sachs who see the immense scale of suffering and argue passionately for massive coordinated investments in aid to help countries break out of what he calls poverty traps.
Big, large-scale interventions.
Yes. And then you have others, equally vocal, like William Easterly and Dambisa Moyo, who come from a very different perspective.
Right.
They argue that large-scale aid often does more harm than good. It prevents self-reliance, distorts markets, maybe corrupts local institutions.
Their view is more about free markets incentives.
Exactly. More optimistic about organic growth, with some, like Easterly, suggesting that maybe there are no such things as poverty traps if the right market conditions are in place.
So two very different viewpoints.
Very different. And the sources wisely emphasize that while these broad ideological debates are important and loud, what truly matters, based on the evidence they present, isn't just whether aid is given or where the money comes from, but critically, where it actually goes. The specific projects funded, and most importantly, how effectively and appropriately they are implemented on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense. Details matter. You mentioned poverty traps. That sources introduce this core theoretical concept, the S-shaped curve, right? Can you walk us through that?
Right, the S-shaped curve. So the idea behind it is this. Imagine your income is on the horizontal axis and your future income based on investment is on the vertical axis.
Okay.
If you are extremely poor with very little income, any small investment you can manage to make, maybe in better seeds or health or a bit of education, it barely increases your future income at all.
So you're stuck.
You're potentially stuck on that flat initial part of the S, trapped in a low equilibrium. But the theory suggests if you can somehow get enough income to make a slightly larger investment,
Get over hump.
exactly, get over a certain threshold, maybe through aid, maybe a windfall, your income could then start growing much more rapidly. You ride up the steep part of the S
Right.
before perhaps flattening out again at a much higher level of income.
Right.
So that S shape is presented as one possible explanation for why people might be persistently poor.
But it's just one model.
It's crucial, as the sources point out, that this is just one model. They also present an alternative view, like the one in Figure 2 in the material, where income growth is actually fastest for the absolute poorest people and then slows down as they get richer. More like a curve bending the other way.
Ah, okay. So that view suggests no real poverty trap holding people down.
Exactly. That view implies less need for a big external push to get onto a permanently higher income path. So these different models have very different policy implications.
Got it. Okay, that S-curve idea gives us a framework. One area the book explores in detail, and it's really counterintuitive, is whether there's a nutrition-based poverty trap.
Yes.
You'd think the poor would spend every possible penny just getting enough calories to be strong enough to work, right?
Right.
But the sources reveal a puzzle here.
They absolutely do, and it challenges a very common assumption. Data from numerous countries shows that food isn't always the single highest percentage of spending for poor households.
Really?
Yeah, and even when extra money becomes available, it doesn't all go into buying more food or specifically more calories. The sources highlight a study in Udaipur, India, showing poor households could actually spend about 30% more on food if they simply cut back on things like alcohol, tobacco, and spending on festivals.
So they have some discretionary spending, even if small.
They do. And in India more broadly, despite significant economic growth over the years, average calorie consumption per person has actually declined.
Declined. How?
Well, people are spending the same or more money on food, but it seems they're choosing different, more expensive, perhaps tastier food items like sugar, snacks, better quality rice, rather than simply maximizing the sheer quantity of basic calories.
Interesting. So getting more bulk calories isn't always the absolute top priority for adults.
It suggests not.
Yeah.
At least not in the simple way the basic nutrition trap model might predict.
Okay, but hang on. Malnutrition rates are high in many of these places, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean calories are a huge problem?
That's a great question, and it is much more nuanced. Malnutrition is a significant problem, absolutely. You see that in the high BMI-based malnourishment rates in India mentioned in the sources. But perhaps the sources are suggesting it's less about a strict adult calorie trap where you're simply too weak to work because you don't eat enough.
Like the Paxoling example they mentioned.
Exactly. Maybe it's less about that and more about deficiencies in crucial micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and the overall quality of the diet impacting health and productivity in more complex ways.
Okay, so quality over just quantity for adults.
Potentially. But where the sources really emphasize a potential S-shaped trap is the long-term impact, especially for children.
Early life.
Yes. They mention the Barker hypothesis, this powerful idea connecting poor nutrition or stress very early in life, even in the womb, to long-term health problems and significantly reduced future earning potential and life chances.
That sounds critical.
It is. The Tanzania iodine example they give is dramatic. Mothers receiving simple iodine capsules resulted in their children completing, on average, half a year more of schooling.
Wow, just from iodine.
Just from iodine. Tiny intervention, massive downstream effects over a lifetime. But then the puzzle deepens. Why are even incredibly cheap interventions that offer massive lifetime benefits, like that iodized sol or deworming pills that cost just a few cents, but the sources estimate can add hundreds of dollars in extra lifetime income? Why aren't they universally adopted?
Yeah, the Kenya deworming example was striking. Parents refusing to pay even a few cents.
Exactly, for something with such a huge proven return.
So why is that? Why wouldn't people jump at these incredibly cheap things that could make such a massive long-term difference for their children?
Well, the sources suggest several possible reasons, and it's likely a mix. There can be significant suspicion of outsiders telling them what to do, especially from, Western NGOs or governments.
Like the vegetable garland protest story.
Right. The West Bengal story where villagers protested being told to eat more vegetables by, wearing garlands of vegetables, it shows real pushback.
Okay, so suspicion. What else?
Another factor might be prioritizing other aspects of life, perhaps aiming for a more pleasant life today, as the sources put it, choosing to buy small consumer goods like cell phone top-ups or shampoo sachets.
Things that offer immediate gratification.
Perhaps. Things that are cheap and readily available, especially in countries with big domestic markets like India and Mexico. The sources also argue that for adults, the primary constraints might often be other things entirely, like a lack of decent jobs or even depression,
Hmm.
rather than being physically unable to work due to simple calorie deficiency, which is what the basic trap model implies. The Pakasolan story might illustrate low energy, but maybe the cause isn't just calories.
But they make a clear distinction for kids, right?
They make a crucial distinction. For unborn babies and very young children, nutrition is likely critical and probably does follow that S-shaped trajectory. It profoundly affects their physical and cognitive development, shaping their entire lifetime potential.
So the early investment is where the S shape might really bite.
That seems to be the argument. Even if adult nutrition isn't the main trap, early childhood nutrition definitely could be.
Got it. Beyond just nutrition, health in general is a big theme. Malaria and poor water and sanitation are flagged as potential health-based poverty traps.
Absolutely. The sources dive into the ongoing debate around malaria. Is it primarily a fundamental cause of poverty, as figures like Sachs suggest, debilitating populations and hindering development?
Or is it a symptom?
Or is a country's inability to control malaria more a symptom of deeper issues, like poor governance and weak institutions, as others argue?
What does the evidence say?
Evidence from historical eradication campaigns in the U.S. South, Latin America, even more recent work in India suggests that successfully eradicating malaria does seem to improve life outcomes and earnings, especially for children born after eradication.
So it does have an effect.
It seems to, although maybe not quite to the dramatic extent some early estimates suggested. And similarly, access to clean water and sanitation has huge demonstrable impacts on health.
Reduces diarrhea, child mortality.
Exactly, which is absolutely crucial for allowing children to grow and develop physically and cognitively. Fewer sick days means more learning, better growth.
But providing piped water and modern sewage systems is typically seen as incredibly expensive, right?
Oh, yeah.
How do you tackle that?
Conventionally, yes, it's a massive infrastructure challenge. The sources mention estimates around $20 per household per month, which is often just too expensive for governments in low-income countries.
Right.
However, the story of the Gram Vikas NGO in Orissa, India, offers a really powerful alternative model. They managed to provide piped water and in-home sanitation much more cheaply by making it a community project. They insisted on universal participation from everyone in a village. Crucially, they even challenged entrenched caste barriers by requiring all households, regardless of caste, to connect to the same water system and build toilets.
Wow, that's tackling social issues too.
It built social capital alongside the pipes. This communal approach lowered costs and ensured buy-in. But this experience, combined with the low take-up of other incredibly cheap health interventions we talked about.
Like breastfeeding or chlorine drops.
Exactly. Breastfeeding costs nothing, yet fewer than 40% globally do it exclusively for 6 months. Chlorine drops cost literally cents a month, cut diarrhea by almost half in studies, yet take-up is low even when heavily subsidized. In Zambia, even at a price of just 0.7 ppp, a quarter of people didn't buy it.
So it raises that same question again. If these simple, proven, low-cost health technologies exist, why aren't they used more widely? It can't just be the cost.
It clearly isn't just cost. It points strongly towards issues of information, belief, and, crucially, trust.
Trust in the providers.
Yeah.
Or the product.
Both, potentially. The sources highlight serious problems with the quality of healthcare itself, particularly in poor areas. Studies like the Delhi Vignette study showed doctors, especially the many unqualified ones, often had shockingly low competence levels.
Sometimes recommending harmful things.
Sometimes recommending actively harmful actions, yes. And learning about health is inherently difficult for anyone, rich or poor. Many common illnesses just get better on their own. They're self-limiting.
Right.
So it's easy to form spurious associations. You try something, maybe a traditional remedy, maybe a random injection from a quack, and if you happen to get better anyway, you assume that thing worked.
Reinforcing potentially useless or bad practices.
Exactly. And this gets compounded in unregulated markets where the person giving the advice, the doctor, might also be the one selling the medicine directly. There's a clear conflict of interest. The sources draw a direct parallel to vaccine hesitancy in wealthier countries, noting how much harder it must be for the poor to make informed health choices when they have even less access to reliable information and trustworthy providers.
Which brings us neatly to that puzzling phenomenon of low immunization rates, even when the vaccines themselves are provided completely free by the government or NGOs.
Yes.
The sources mention people often blamed lazy nurses for missed appointments, or clinics running out of stock.
Yes, that was a common perception, and sometimes there are genuine issues with supply chains or nurse availability, absolutely. But the sources suggest the real barrier is often deeper. It might be more about parental beliefs, maybe some lingering distrust, or simply procrastination.
Procrastination, putting off something so important.
Well, think about it. It's important, yes, but maybe not urgently needed today. It's easy to put off until the next clinic day and then the next. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The Seva Mandir NGO in India, working with researchers, designed an experiment to test this. They didn't just offer the vaccine for free, they offered parents small, tangible incentives for bringing their children in.
What kind of incentives?
2 pounds of dal, a staple food, lentils worth about $1.83 adjusted for purchasing power for each immunization completed, and a set of steel plates, useful household items for finishing the full course.
Dal and plates for vaccines. How did that go down?
The doctor involved was initially very skeptical, worried it wouldn't work, or that it felt ethically wrong, like bribing people to do something they should do anyway for their children's health.
I could see that concern.
But it was a roaring success. Immunization rates in the villages with these small, immediate incentives increased sevenfold, reaching 38%.
Sevenfold. Wow. Just for a bit of dal.
Incredible, isn't it? And here's the kicker. Offering the doll incentive actually lowered the overall cost per immunization for the NGO.
How? Giving away dal costs money, surely.
It did, but it ensured the nurses, whose salaries were a fixed cost anyway, were much, much busier and more efficient during the immunization clinics. They weren't sitting around waiting for people who didn't show up. The cost per completed immunization went down.
Wow, that's incredibly counterintuitive but powerful. Sevenfold increase. It seems like small nudges, changing the immediate incentives based on how people actually behave, can have a massive impact.
Absolutely. The sources touch on this when discussing time inconsistency,
Yeah.
that human tendency to prioritize today over tomorrow versus the need to truly believe in the long-term benefit.
Right, we all procrastinate.
We do. But continuously putting off something you genuinely believe has massive life-saving benefits for your child for years. The sources argue that seems unlikely to be purely procrastination.
So it suggests the belief isn't strong enough.
It suggests the belief or the trust or the understanding of just how beneficial those cheap interventions really are might not be fully there. The poor are often capable of complex financial thinking, finding ways to save despite themselves, as we'll see, suggesting they could likely overcome simple time inconsistency if they genuinely valued immunization as highly as, say, public health experts do.
That points back strongly to information, trust, and maybe making the benefits feel more immediate or tangible.
Exactly. It's about understanding the psychology and the perceived value.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to education. The sources argue that poor parents often seem to see the returns on education through that same lens we discussed earlier as S-shaped, like the poverty trap curve.
Yes, this is another fascinating parallel they draw. The belief many parents seem to hold is that early investment in education doesn't pay off much. The flat part of the S again?
First few years of primary school don't change much.
That might be the perception. Sending your kid to first or second grade, maybe it doesn't seem to make a huge difference to their future prospects, especially if they're likely to end up doing manual labor anyway, but
What?
they might also believe that getting a child over the hump, finishing secondary school, maybe even getting some college education, yields huge, potentially life-changing returns, that steep part of the S.
Okay, but is that belief accurate? Are the returns really S-shaped?
Well, this is crucial. The sources suggest this belief is often mistaken. The actual evidence tends to point towards the returns on education being much more linear. Each additional year of schooling seems to increase earnings roughly proportionally.
So the belief is wrong, but it still drives behavior.
Exactly. And this mistaken belief can lead families who have very limited resources to focus everything, money, effort, hope, on the one child they perceive as the most academically promising. Essentially, picking a winner to try and get them over that perceived hump.
While maybe neglecting the others.
Potentially, yes. The sources give examples like Shantarama's children, where the most promising son went to college but the others dropped out early, maybe because the family didn't invest the same hope or resources in them. Or the Naganaji family spending 10% of their farming income on a private boarding school for the intelligent youngest son, while his siblings barely studied past second grade.
So the belief itself, even if inaccurate, can create an unequal outcome within the family, like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Precisely. The belief in the S-shape can cause parents and even teachers to give up on children who fall behind early. They stop investing effort because they don't see the point. This confirms the low expectations and effectively creates a poverty trap for those children, even if they could have benefited significantly from continued schooling.
And teachers, too.
Yes. The sources mention how lower caste teachers might assign worse grades to lower caste students, perhaps genuinely convinced these children aren't capable of doing well beyond a certain point, reinforcing the S-shaped expectation. It's a lethal combination. Huge expectations and investment for a chosen few, little faith and minimal investment for others, perpetuating inequality based on a potentially false premise about how education works.
Wow. Okay, the sources also look hard at the education system itself. Government schools, private schools, NGOs.
Right. Government schools in many poor areas face huge challenges. Teacher absenteeism is often high. There's immense pressure to just rush through a rigid, often unsuitable curriculum.
Regardless of whether kids are actually learning.
Exactly, resulting in many students leaving school without even basic literacy and numeracy skills. Despite this, very cheap private schools, sometimes charging fees as low as $1.50 a month, are booming. Often started by educated local women looking for an opportunity.
How they better?
The evidence is mixed, but they are responsive to parental demand. And the sources highlight NGO interventions that offer really promising alternatives by focusing differently.
Like Pratham.
Yes, Pritham's community-based program in Jaunpur, India, used local volunteers for focused, remedial teaching of core skills reading, basic math outside the formal school system. They showed dramatic learning gains compared to control groups.
So focusing on the basics works.
It seems so. Even working with government teachers, like in Pratham's Bahar summer camps, achieved similar gains when they focused relentlessly on basic reading and math, rather than just offering standard teacher training or sticking rigidly to the official curriculum that left many kids behind.
So it raises a big question. Is the problem always the teachers? Or is it the system and the curriculum that asks them to teach advanced concepts to kids who haven't mastered the fundamentals?
That's exactly the question the sources pose. Maybe simplifying the curriculum, focusing on mastery of basics, and allowing children to learn at their own pace is far more effective than the current model.
And what about creating opportunities for those kids who, for whatever reason, fall through the cracks of that often dysfunctional traditional system?
That's where initiatives mentioned in the sources, like Ramen boards or Infosys's testing centers, come in. They deliberately look for raw intelligence and analytical skills through aptitude testing, regardless of a person's formal qualifications or the school certificate they hold.
So bypassing the flawed system.
Exactly. It offers an alternative pathway for talent that wasn't captured or nurtured by the traditional education system. It provides a crucial source of hope and potential social mobility that gets around that S-shaped belief trap parents and teachers might fall into.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Population and family size. We generally observe that richer countries have lower fertility rates. Is having large families inherently bad for the poor, according to the sources?
Well, the sources explore this complex and sometimes controversial question very carefully. There's the old Malthusian argument, population growth outstripping fixed resources leading to poverty.
Right.
And they even touch on the deeply controversial gift of the dying idea, the hypothesis that the tragedy of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in some places might, paradoxically, lead to long-run economic benefits by reducing population pressure and changing dependency ratios.
That's a heavy idea.
Very. However, the sources really challenge the simple, often assumed idea that having more children necessarily disadvantages those specific children in terms of the education or health investment they receive from their parents compared to what they would have received in a smaller family.
How do they challenge that?
By looking at studies that examine unexpected increases in family size, like the natural experiment of having twins, or variations in the sex mix of children that lead families to have more kids than planned, these studies often find no clear evidence that children in these accidentally larger families receive significantly less education or health investment per child.
So if the kids aren't necessarily suffering academically or health-wise in those specific situations, who does bear the cost of larger family size?
The sources suggest it's very likely the mother who bears the brunt of it.
How so?
Well, the Pro Familia program in Colombia, which successfully expanded access to family planning services, provided evidence suggesting that enabling women to better control their fertility allowed them to get more schooling themselves and find more formal sector jobs.
Right, so it impacts the woman's opportunities.
Significantly. This raises an important question. Is the issue primarily just a lack of access to contraception? Or are there deeper social and economic factors influencing family size decisions? And crucially, who gets to make those decisions within the household?
All right, it's not always a joint decision.
It seems not. The sources argue that simply making contraceptives available isn't always enough on its own. The MATLAB program in Bangladesh, often cited as a family planning success, involved intensive home visits by female health workers, which potentially allowed women to adopt family planning methods without their husband's explicit knowledge or permission, bypassing potential conflict.
Interesting.
And a fascinating experiment in Zambia drove this home. Women given contraceptive vouchers privately were much more likely to use contraception and reported significantly fewer unwanted births compared to women who were given the exact same vouchers but in the presence of their husbands.
Wow. That really highlights the power dynamics.
It powerfully highlights that family decisions, particularly around something as sensitive as fertility, are not always made harmoniously by a single unit. There can be hidden conflicts, differing preferences, and power imbalances, often between husbands and wives.
And you mentioned earlier that children can also be seen partly as financial instruments by poor parents. That sounds harsh, but the sources explain the logic, right?
Yes, that's a crucial, if sometimes uncomfortable, perspective highlighted by the sources. For many poor parents, especially where formal social safety nets are weak or non-existent, children are their primary social security, their form of savings, and their insurance policy against old age, illness, or other hardships.
The Pak Sudarno example.
Exactly. Pak Sudarno, with 9 children, explicitly stating he had so many to ensure at least a couple would be around and willing to take care of him when he was old. It's a raw illustration of that economic reality.
And this happens elsewhere, too.
Elderly parents receiving financial help from their adult children is very common in many parts of the world, like in China, as the sources mention. This economic perspective also deeply influences gender investment within the family.
How so?
If daughters are expected to marry out of the family, perhaps requiring an expensive dowry, while sons are expected to stay and support the parents in old age,
then parents might invest less in daughters.
from a purely rational economic perspective focused on old age security, they might invest less in daughters' health or education compared to sons. This calculation can lead to tragic outcomes like neglect or even sex-selective abortions, as explicitly marketed by those horrifying illegal services in places like Delhi, promising to spend 500 rupees now and save 50,000 rupees later by determining and aborting female fetuses.
That's incredibly bleak. It really underscores that the family unit isn't monolithic.
Absolutely not. There are internal dynamics, differing incentives, potential conflicts, and power balances.
And this matters for other things, too. The sources mention women's property titles affecting their say in decisions, or women earning more correlating with the family eating better.
Exactly. Maybe it's linked to social rules about who is traditionally responsible for buying food. Recognizing and understanding these internal family dynamics is absolutely key for designing effective policies, whether it's health, education, microfinance that might otherwise fail, because they mistakenly treat the household as a single, unified decision maker with perfectly aligned goals.
Right. Okay, let's talk about another massive, constant issue the poor face: risk. They are incredibly exposed to shocks, aren't they? Illness, job loss, bad weather.
That's a huge point in the sources. They face constant vulnerability without the formal safety nets like insurance, unemployment benefits, diversified financial assets that people in richer countries often take for granted.
So how do they cope?
They rely on informal and often very costly coping mechanisms. One striking example from the sources is the extent of occupational diversification. A survey in West Bengal found the median poor family engaged in 7 different occupations.
7, just to spread the risk.
Presumably, trying not to have all their eggs in one basket. They also rely heavily on borrowing from neighbors, friends, or local moneylenders when a shock hits.
Do these informal networks work well?
They help, but the sources discuss their limits. A study in Nigeria by Udry found that while these informal insurance networks existed and helped smooth consumption somewhat, families still saw a significant drop in their consumption when they experienced a negative shock. The networks weren't perfect buffers.
And some shocks are harder to insure informally.
Exactly. What's fascinating and quite concerning from the sources is how poorly health shocks, in particular, seem to be covered by these informal networks. Health expenses are often the most financially devastating events, wiping out savings and pushing families into debt.
The Ibu Mpat story.
Yes, the Ibu Mtat story is such a stark illustration. Her daughter gave her a television instead of money to help pay off huge medical debts incurred from her husband's illness. And Ibu Mtat seemed to think it was almost normal not to receive direct financial help for health expenses from family or neighbors.
That suggests health risk is somehow seen differently.
It seems so. Maybe it's too big, too unpredictable, or too correlated within a community for informal networks to handle effectively.
So why isn't formal insurance, health insurance, crop insurance more readily available or used more widely by the poor if they're so vulnerable?
Well, the sources point to several systemic hurdles that make formal insurance markets for the poor very difficult to establish and sustain.
Like what?
Credibility is a major one. It's hard for people, especially those who may have been let down by formal systems before, to trust that an often distant insurance company will actually pay out a claim, potentially years down the line when they most need it.
Okay, trust.
Then there are the classic insurance problems. Adverse selection. This is when only the people who know they are highest risk are the most likely to buy the insurance.
Which drives the price up for everyone.
Exactly, making it unaffordable or unattractive for lower risk people, potentially causing the market to unravel. And then there's moral hazard.
That's when having insurance changes your behavior.
Precisely. Because you're covered, you might take more risks than you otherwise would. The infamous cow ear story from India is a perfect, if slightly bizarre, example of moral hazard combined with fraud.
Remind me.
Insurance claims for lost cattle apparently led to a black market for cow's ears from any dead cow, insured or not, which people would then present as proof their insured cow had died to claim the payout.
Good grief. So fraud makes it harder too.
Absolutely. And the low take-up of weather insurance in India, even when offered through trusted microfinance channels and heavily subsidized, highlights how all these challenges, trust, adverse selection, moral hazard, plus the complexity of the products and maybe payouts not matching actual losses, well, make formal insurance a really tough sell. The market often ends up only offering insurance against rare, truly catastrophic events, which feels less relevant and is less utilized than coverage for the smaller, more frequent shocks people actually grapple with day to day.
So this pervasive, unmanaged risk forces the poor into these costly, sometimes inefficient coping strategies, like having 7 jobs.
Right.
And it also limits their willingness to invest in things that could potentially pay off big in the long run, but carry some risk, like farming more ambitious crops or starting a bigger business.
Yes, risk has these deep, often preventative consequences. It can absolutely stop people from taking the long view. If you constantly fear that a shock, illness, job loss, drought, flood could derail your plans and wipe out your investment,
You play it safe.
you might rationally choose to play it safe. You might hesitate to invest precious resources in things like your children's higher education or starting a slightly riskier but potentially more profitable business because you feel you won't be able to see it through, or that one bad shock will wipe out any gains and leave you worse off.
So a sense of stability, maybe from insurance or a secure job, might be a fundamental prerequisite for people to feel comfortable investing in their future.
That's a strong implication from the sources. That basic stability may be necessary before people feel they can afford to take calculated risks or make long-term investments.
Which brings us nicely to saving. The sources mention poor people saving in sometimes surprising and incredibly patient ways, like building a house literally brick by brick over many, many years.
That example is so powerful, isn't it? It shows extraordinary patience and a very strong desire to save for big, important goals, but it also suggests they might lack better, more convenient, or more efficient options for saving money. The sources discuss the barriers banks face in reaching the poor, often regulatory hurdles, the high transaction costs of serving many low-balance accounts, or simply a lack of physical branches or ATMs nearby.
So is there a micro-saving revolution waiting to happen with new technologies like mobile money?
That's a key question. The brick-by-brick saving highlights amazing determination, but it's also potentially inefficient, right? Buying materials in tiny installments is usually more expensive than buying in bulk.
Yeah. So why don't they save up the money first and then buy the materials all at once, potentially saving faster overall?
And that gets us right back to the challenge of self-control, doesn't it?
It does. Saving is hard for everyone.
It really is. The sources discuss how inherently difficult saving is because it requires a sacrifice, now not spending money you have in your hand for a gain that's often far off in the future. Our brains, seem wired to favor immediate rewards.
Like failed New Year's resolutions.
Exactly. Or struggling to save adequately for retirement, even when we know we should. These are relatable examples for many people, regardless of income.
But the poor often seem acutely aware of this struggle with self-control, don't they? The sources give examples of people actively trying to tie themselves to the mast, like Ulysses.
They absolutely are. The sources give that great example of the Kenyan farmers who bought fertilizer right after harvest, when they had cash, even though they wouldn't actually need to use it until the next planting season, months later.
Why do that? Why not just keep the cash?
They explicitly saw this early purchase, not just as buying fertilizer, but as a clever way to freeze their money, to make it inaccessible for spending on daily temptations or those frequent small emergencies that crop up, emergencies that one farmer, Michael Madimba, admitted they could otherwise, and probably would, just suspend or postpone if the money wasn't easily available.
So the fertilizer bag becomes a savings device.
Effectively, yes, a commitment device.
Yeah.
And the story of Wycliffe Otieno, another farmer whose job as a bicycle taxi driver took him into town regularly, highlights how even a seemingly small inconvenience can be a major bottleneck.
How so?
Because his job meant he could easily check if the fertilizer shop had stock right when he happened to have money from a fair. Other farmers who didn't go to town as often might miss the chance to buy when they had cash because they couldn't easily check availability. It shows how tiny logistical hurdles can prevent saving and investment.
Wow. Okay, so people try to create their own commitment devices. What about formal ones, like special savings accounts?
Well, experiments with formal commitment devices, like special savings accounts where you lock your money away until a certain date, or locked health boxes designed to earmark money specifically for future health expenses, show a bit of paradox.
A paradox.
While these devices are designed precisely to help with self-control by making it harder to access the money impulsively, people are often quite reluctant to sign up for them or use them aggressively.
Why? If they help with a known problem.
Because they fear needing the money for some other unforeseen emergency later and being unable to access it because it's locked away. It seems using a commitment device often requires a significant initial act of self-control and confidence just to commit in the first place.
Huh. Need self-control to adopt a tool that helps with self-control.
Kind of. And this whole difficulty with saving and self-control is massively compounded for the poor. They face far more difficult decisions about scarcity every single day. They face greater stress and uncertainty. Both of these things are known to impair cognitive function and deplete self-control resources.
So they have a harder job managing self-control with fewer mental resources available.
Exactly. Compared to richer people, where saving is often automated through employer pension plans or mandatory systems, the poor have to exert constant, conscious effort to save, making it much, much harder.
Okay, let's look at the other side of the coin from saving credit. The sources describe the incredibly high interest rates, often charged by informal moneylenders, like the Kabuliwalas in Calcutta, who had this fearsome reputation.
They did indeed, a reputation for being fierce enforcers. And the common explanation you often hear for these astronomically high interest rates charged by informal lenders is, well, it must be because default rates among poor borrowers are incredibly high. They're just too risky.
But is that true?
Well, studies mentioned in the sources really challenge this assumption. They find that actual default rates on informal loans are often surprisingly low. One study in Pakistan found a median default rate of just 2%, despite average interest rates being a whopping 78%.
Only 2% default. So why the crazy high interest rates then?
The sources argue that the high rates are primarily driven by other factors. Mainly, the very high cost for the lender of gathering reliable information about potential poor borrowers who often lack formal credit histories, verifiable income streams, or traditional collateral.
Okay, information costs. What else?
And the high cost and difficulty of enforcing contracts if things go wrong, especially in contexts where the formal legal system is weak, inaccessible, or slow.
So borrowing from someone scary, like the Kabuliwala.
Borrowing from someone who has the power, or crucially, the reputation for being willing to use intimidation or even physical force to ensure repayment, that actually reduces the lender's monitoring and enforcement costs.
Right, they don't need lawyers.
Exactly. It makes the loan potentially cheaper and less risky for the lender to make, even if the interest rate seems extortionate and the experience terrifying for the borrower.
That makes a grim kind of sense. Microfinance was supposed to be the solution here, right? Providing affordable credit, replacing the money lenders.
That was the hope. And microfinance institutions, MFIs, have certainly expanded access to credit for many. But the sources mention issues there too. MFIs often rely heavily on a social compact within borrowing groups and regular, often public group meetings to maintain repayment discipline. Many insist on near zero default rates from the group as a whole.
The group pressure model.
Yes. However, recent crises in the microfinance sector in India, in places like Krishna, Karnataka, Orissa, and Andhra Pradesh, often sparked by external factors like political interference, promising debt waivers, or liquidity problems hitting the MFIs themselves, show the potential fragility of the system.
How so?
Once repayments stop, perhaps due to a widespread shock or a loss of confidence that others are repaying, the whole social pressure mechanism can quickly unravel. The system relies on everyone believing that everyone else will repay and that the MFI is strong.
So the MFIs are right to be intensely focused on managing those beliefs about repayment.
It suggests they are. Their focus on maintaining repayment discipline, even if it seems harsh sometimes, might be crucial for the survival of the model itself.
But microcredit does seem to have some specific, demonstrable positive effects, according to the sources. It's not all negative.
No, not at all. And there's one particularly interesting positive effect highlighted consistently in the sources. Studies like the Spandana and Alamana evaluations show one clear, consistent impact. Households receiving microcredit tend to significantly reduce their spending on non-essential temptation goods.
Temptation goods, like what?
Things like daily tea and snacks, cigarettes, alcohol, maybe lottery tickets. Spending on these items often decreased in households that took microloans.
Why would that happen?
It aligns with the intuition of some MFI leaders, like Padmaja Reddy of Spandana, who was quoted in the sources. She believed her clients would cut back on these small, discretionary, often impulsive expenses if they had a better, more productive way to use that money, like investing it in their small business via the loan repayments. It suggests the loan provided a mechanism, maybe partly a commitment device, to redirect spending.
Interesting. What about the businesses themselves, the ones often funded by microcredit? The sources describe the owners vividly as capitalists without capital.
Yes, it's a great phrase. Many poor people are indeed entrepreneurs, almost by necessity. They run tiny, often single-person businesses selling snacks, tailoring clothes, repairing bicycles, frequently operating from their homes, or a small market stall.
And these businesses can be profitable.
The sources highlight that these tiny businesses can have surprisingly high marginal returns, meaning the profit you get from investing just a little bit more capital can be very high.
Like the cookie shop example.
Exactly. The woman selling cookies whose small loan allowed her to buy ingredients in slightly larger quantities, resulting in something like a 50% net return on that extra investment within just a week. Huge marginal return.
There's a but, isn't there?
There is. While the marginal return on a tiny bit more capital can be high, the overall return on the total investment in the business, including the owner's own time and immense effort, is often very, very low. Sometimes so low that it might not even cover the opportunity cost of their labor if you valued their time at even the local minimum wage. Like the person running a tiny cigarette and incense shop mentioned working long hours for potentially very little net profit once you account for their time.
So the big puzzle is, if the marginal returns to a little more capital are so high, why don't these businesses grow rapidly? Why don't they borrow more, reinvest, and scale up to lift the owners out of poverty?
That is the central puzzle. Part of the answer, as we discussed, is limited access to larger amounts of credit needed for real scaling, which are often expensive and difficult for the poor to obtain. But
Again,
the sources also note that many poor people who are eligible for microcredit or even slightly larger loans choose not to borrow or borrow less than they could.
why would they do that if the returns are potentially high?
This could well be due to high-risk aversion, the fear of borrowing a significant amount, investing it in the business, and then having something go wrong, bad weather, illness, changing market demand, and being unable to repay. Failing could mean losing everything, falling into deeper debt, and being far worse off than before.
So the risk of failure looms large, even if the potential rewards are high.
It seems so, which raises another really important question posed implicitly by the sources. What if a steady, secure, even relatively low-wage job is actually more transformational for overcoming poverty than encouraging everyone to become a potentially precarious micro-entrepreneur?
And the sources seem to strongly suggest that stable jobs are indeed hugely impactful, maybe even more so than we typically assume.
Absolutely. The story of the village near the zinc factory in Orissa is such a powerful illustration from the sources. Getting a secure factory job, even if the conditions weren't perfect, provided enough stability and income security that it started a virtuous cycle. Parents felt secure enough about the future to invest more heavily in their children's education for both sons and daughters. This led to significant upward mobility across generations, all stemming from that initial stable employment opportunity.
Wow. Any other evidence?
Yes, the study of the Mexican maquiladoras assembly plants is also striking. It showed significantly taller children being born to mothers who had managed to get stable factory jobs compared to similar women in the same communities without that opportunity.
Taller children. How does that link?
Better maternal nutrition and possibly less stress during pregnancy, enabled by the steady income and maybe workplace benefits. It dramatically illustrates the fundamental power of a good, steady job to improve basic life outcomes, reaching right down to the next generation's physical development.
So that steady income stream provides the crucial stability needed to take the long view.
Exactly. It enables people to invest in their children's health and education, rather than being constantly consumed by managing daily risk and income volatility.
So how do you go about creating more of these good jobs if they're so key? It sounds like it's not just about building more factories, though that's part of it.
It's complex, and the sources point to several potential areas. One is making urban migration easier and safer, improving housing options, transport, and basic safety nets in cities so people can actually move to where larger job markets might exist.
Like facilitating movement.
Another is improving infrastructure, roads, power, communication in smaller towns and secondary cities to make them more viable locations for businesses to set up and grow, creating jobs outside the megacities.
As in the opportunities.
Finding the right balance in labor laws is also mentioned, providing essential worker security and rights, but not making regulations so rigid and costly that businesses are afraid to hire formally at all.
A tricky balance.
Very. And perhaps most fundamentally, figuring out how to get the financial sector, banks, investment funds to lend enough capital, and the right kind of capital, to allow businesses to reach a larger scale where they can generate significant numbers of decent jobs. This links back to that S-shaped idea again. Maybe production technologies require a certain minimum scale of investment to become truly profitable and create substantial employment beyond just the owner-operator.
Right, getting businesses up that steep part of the curve.
Exactly, which requires more than just microloans.
This brings us towards the end, thinking about the role of institutions in government. The sources discuss those big I institutions, things like secure property rights, the rule of law, democratic accountability, which are central to grand theories of development, like in the book, Why Nations Fail.
Yes, those theories argue that broad, often deeply entrenched institutions, sometimes extractive ones inherited from colonial eras, fundamentally shape a society's long-term economic trajectory.
And bad institutions stick around.
The argument is often that bad institutions are persistent because powerful elites benefit from them and use their power and wealth to maintain the status quo, a cycle sometimes called the iron law of oligarchy. Change is hard because the winners resist it.
So, are the sources pessimistic about changing institutions?
They share some healthy skepticism about the effectiveness of wholesale, externally imposed institutional reforms, or just hoping that broad changes like democratization will automatically fix everything on the ground. These things are slow and complex. However,
Yes.
where they inject a crucial dose of practical optimism is in their focus on the possibility and the proven effectiveness of improving institutions at the margin, finding concrete ways to make existing systems work better, even within flawed, larger structures.
Like fighting corruption in small, targeted ways rather than trying to eliminate it entirely overnight.
Exactly. The Ugandan newspaper campaign is a fantastic, simple example from the sources. Just publishing information in local newspapers about how much money primary schools were supposed to receive from the central government.
Made a difference.
It drastically increased the amount of money that actually reached the schools because local citizens, parents, and honest officials were now empowered with information to hold the system accountable and demand what was due. Leakage dropped significantly.
Information is power. Any other examples?
The Indonesian Road Project study is another great one. Researchers went out and physically measured the actual quantity of materials used and wages paid on supposedly completed road projects, comparing it to official reports.
What did they find?
They found significant theft, fewer materials used, lower wages paid than reported, and were able to directly link that corruption to the demonstrably lower quality and durability of the roads. Audits with teeth revealed the problem.
And the Indian police decoy experiment.
Also powerful, simply creating the fear of being monitored by occasionally sending trained decoys, mystery shoppers essentially, to police stations to try and register a fake case, significantly increased the rate at which police officers registered legitimate cases brought by actual citizens.
Just the possibility of being watched changed behavior?
Yes. These are all examples of finding concrete, often data-driven, evidence-based ways to improve the day-to-day functioning of institutions and reduce corruption incrementally from the bottom up or through targeted monitoring, even within broader systems that remain imperfect.
That feels more hopeful, more actionable. What about decentralization and democracy on the ground?
They also work in complex ways. In India's village councils, panchayats, the policy of mandating reserved positions for women leaders, despite initial skepticism that they would just be puppets for their husbands or local male elites.
Did it work?
It actually led to measurable changes in local government spending priorities. Villages led by women tended to invest more in things typically prioritized by women, like drinking water infrastructure, public health, and local roads. And crucially, it also changed perceptions. Voters in villages that had experienced female leaders were subsequently more likely to view women as effective leaders and vote for them, challenging those entrenched patriarchal norms.
So representation really can matter and change outcomes.
It suggests it can, yes. Even mandated representation can shift priorities and, over time, change attitudes.
And what about ethnic or caste-based voting? Is that just an inevitable feature of democratic politics in diverse poor countries, that people will always vote along identity lines rather than policy?
Well, the Benin experiment mentioned in the sources showed that, yes, clientelist appeals direct promises of benefits to specific ethnic groups and ethnic-focused speeches were indeed more electorally successful than broad national unity messages, at least in a candidate's own ethnic stronghold. That reality exists.
So identity politics works.
It can work, but the sources also present compelling evidence that this isn't necessarily a fixed or immutable reality. Political behavior can be changed.
How?
An NGO campaign in Uttar Pradesh, India, used simple tools like street plays and puppet shows to deliver messages, encouraging people to vote based on development issues and candidate performance, rather than just blindly following caste affiliations.
Did that work? Against something as entrenched as caste?
It actually showed a measurable effect. It reduced the probability of voters choosing a candidate solely based on sharing their caste identity. This indicates that voters can be swayed by a credible message focused on policy and governance if it cuts through the noise. Political behavior isn't solely predetermined by identity.
So there's potential to shift politics towards issues.
There seems to be, yes. It requires effort and credible messaging, but it's not impossible.
Okay, so let's try to put it all together now, based on this really rich deep dive into your sources. What are the key takeaways? Why does poverty persist so stubbornly, even when people are often incredibly hardworking and resourceful, beyond the obvious lack of money?
Yeah, boiling it down, the sources really converge on two main interconnected reasons, and they challenge some of the simpler narratives we often hear.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, poor people often lack crucial, specific information or sometimes hold on to incorrect beliefs about things that profoundly impact their lives.
Like what kind of things?
Like the true long-term benefits of preventative health measures like immunization or deworming. Or the actual versus the perceived returns on different levels of education for their kids. Or how politicians actually behave once they get into office versus what they promise, or even basic knowledge about how diseases are transmitted or how financial products work.
And acting on bad information leads to bad outcomes.
Exactly. Acting on these incorrect beliefs, or simply lacking key, actionable information, leads them to make decisions that are perfectly rational given what they think they know, but are ultimately suboptimal for their well-being or long-term prospects. They're trying their best, but with a flawed map.
Okay, so lack of good information and mistaken beliefs. What's the second big reason?
It's the second reason, and this is perhaps less widely appreciated but comes through so strongly in the sources, is that the poor bear direct personal responsibility for far too many difficult decisions that richer people either have handled automatically for them or are supported by robust systems, defaults, and ample resources.
What kind of decisions? Give me examples.
Think about it. Saving money regularly for the future. Purifying their drinking water every single day to make it safe. Ensuring they and their children get enough essential micronutrients from a very limited and often monotonous diet. navigating incredibly complex health decisions with often unreliable or unqualified providers, making agonizing choices about which child to favor for education when resources are scarce, getting insurance, accessing credit.
Things that are often automated or easier for wealthier people?
Precisely. Wealthier people often have retirement savings automatically deducted. Their tap water is usually safe. Their varied diet likely covers micronutrients without thinking. They have access to regulated healthcare and financial advice. The poor have to make these crucial choices consciously, repeatedly, day after day, requiring significant knowledge, attention, and ongoing self-control.
And that takes a toll.
It takes a huge mental toll. These decisions are difficult for anyone, but they are compounded exponentially for the poor by the incredible stress, uncertainty, and sheer cognitive load of managing lives lived constantly at the margin, with minimal resources and no room for error. It depletes those precious self-control resources we talked about.
So it's not just lack of money, it's lack of good information and the overwhelming burden of responsibility for managing every aspect of life.
That seems to be the core message emerging from the evidence presented.
And policy itself seems to be part of the problem sometimes, according to the sources, not just the solution.
Yes, the sources are quite direct and critical about this. They point to what they diagnose as the 3 is problem, often plaguing policy design and implementation aimed at helping the poor.
The 3 is, what are they?
Ideology, ignorance, and inertia.
Okay, break those down. Ideology.
Ideology refers to adopting fashionable development ideas or grand theories, like pushing micro-entrepreneurship for absolutely everyone, or focusing solely on empowering women without considering household dynamics, often without sufficient grounding in rigorous evidence from the specific context, or adapting them appropriately.
Okay.
Ignorance. Ignorance refers to policymakers, often sitting in distant capitals or international organizations, simply not having a deep, granular understanding of the reality on the ground. How people actually live, what their real constraints are, what they believe, how they interact with existing systems, what their priorities are, designing policies in an information vacuum.
And inertia.
Inertia is just the tendency for bad rules, inefficient systems, and demonstrably flawed policies to stay in place simply because they are the status quo. It takes effort and political will to change things. So often, things just drift along unchanged, even when they're known not to be working well.
So policies often fail because they are designed based on ideology or ignorance, and then inertia keeps them going.
That's the argument. Policies frequently fail because they are designed without accounting for the complex realities, the actual incentives, the prevailing beliefs, and the real constraints that people face on the ground.
Any examples of this disconnect?
The sources give examples like nurses being given impossibly long lists of duties they couldn't possibly perform, making failure inevitable, or village education committees being set up with absurdly complex membership rules or meeting requirements that ensure they never actually function effectively. These illustrate how well-intentioned but poorly designed and context-unaware policies can create systemic failures that then lead to blaming the poor, they don't participate, or the frontline workers, they're lazy, when the fundamental problem lies in the flawed design itself.
That's a sobering thought. But the source material isn't entirely pessimistic, is it? There's hope, too.
Definitely not entirely pessimistic. The optimism, and it's a grounded, evidence-based optimism, comes from demonstrating repeatedly throughout the book that careful, well-designed, evidence-based interventions, even relatively small and targeted ones, can make a significant, measurable difference.
But the key is how they're designed.
The key is that they have to be designed with a deep, granular, empathetic understanding of people's actual lives, their constraints, their incentives, their psychology, and their beliefs, not based on abstract theories alone.
Can you give some examples of these successful quiet revolutions?
Sure. Things like informing parents about their rights and simultaneously giving them simple tools and motivation to monitor teacher attendance in schools, like in the Pritham study. Providing small, immediate, culturally appropriate incentives for preventative health behaviors like immunization. Designing savings or commitment devices that are easy to use and genuinely help people overcome self-control hurdles by making the beneficial choice the easier choice. Actively addressing power dynamics within families when designing programs. Finding incremental, data-driven, often low-key ways to fight corruption and improve service delivery. Or shifting political discourse towards policy issues through targeted information campaigns.
So specific, evidence-based, context-aware interventions.
These are all examples from the sources of targeted changes, sometimes nudges, sometimes providing key information or tools that can start virtuous cycles and build on themselves, moving people forward step by addressing the specific bottlenecks they face.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener, having gone through these sources with us? It's clear from this deep dive that tackling poverty isn't just about sending more money or implementing grand, top-down development plans based on abstract theories or sweeping ideologies.
No, it really isn't that simple. It's a deeply complex web. It involves individual decisions made under extreme pressure, deeply held beliefs that may or may not align with scientific evidence, the very real and often hidden dynamics within families, constant exposure to unmanaged risk, and the often imperfect, sometimes frustrating, functioning of institutions, markets, and government services.
And we need to see this through the eyes of people navigating these incredible constraints, making incredibly difficult choices every single day.
Exactly. It really pushes us to think much more specifically about the granular barriers that people face. Is it primarily a lack of crucial information that seems obvious to us but isn't to them? Is it the sheer mental load, the cognitive tax of constantly managing scarcity and stress? Is it a fundamental lack of trust in formal systems or even within their own households that prevents cooperation or uptake of beneficial programs? And it strongly suggests that the most effective interventions might often be quite surprising, sometimes involving relatively small nudges, providing targeted, specific, trustworthy information at the right time, or subtly changing the rules of the game on the ground to make the easier choice also the healthier or more beneficial long-term choice.
Rather than relying solely on massive infrastructure projects or hoping markets will magically fix everything.
Right. It suggests a different, perhaps more humble, but also potentially more effective approach, focused on understanding and addressing the specific constraints and realities of people's lives.
That's definitely a lot to think about. This deep dive into your source material into poor economics has certainly given us a much richer, more nuanced, and I think ultimately a more practical and hopeful picture of poverty and how we might begin to address it effectively.
I hope so. It challenges us to think differently.
It really does. Okay, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider as you reflect on these sources. If the sources point to the three is ideology, ignorance, and inertia as major reasons why even well-intentioned efforts to help the poor often fall short or fail, how might understanding our own susceptibility as individuals and societies to these very same forces, our own reliance on ingrained ideologies, our own pockets of ignorance about nuanced realities outside our direct experience, and our own tendency towards inertia in maintaining existing systems, even when they aren't optimal, how might understanding that help us better recognize and address other complex problems we face, whether they're in our local communities, our workplaces, or tackling global challenges?